Hello, we will start momentarily. We're just waiting for a few more people to come in. I see more people are coming in. So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Just a reminder that this session is being recorded and the recording will be made available later. And we will tell you exactly where to access the recording for this session. There is a Q&A question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. We ask that you use this feature to ask your questions. We have a team of UC San Diego folks who are ready to answer your questions. Don't share any personal information if you could. Also ask your questions anonymously. We will reply back privately to you and we'll try to address as many questions as we can. For those of you who might prefer to ask your questions in Vietnamese, you're welcome to do so. We have someone who will be able to answer back in Vietnamese. And again, we will also provide directions on how you can listen to this video once recorded in your preferred language. Next slide. Thank you everyone for joining us on day 2 of the International Parent and Family Orientation at UC San Diego. We have a week long of programming for you. As I said, this is day 2, the first session of 2 sessions. We have another one in about an hour. My name is Karina Vieira. I'm the Senior Officer for the Office of Parent and Family Programs. And I'm joined today by Tricia Schuler, Assistant Director of International Student Services, who will talk to you about visa status for your student and everything related to the topic. And she will also be able to answer your questions as well. So let me turn it over to Tricia. You can take the floor. Thank you, Tricia.
Great, thank you so much, Karina. So hello and welcome to all of our international parents. On behalf of the International Students and Programs Office, also known as ISPO, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be around the world. My name again is Tricia Schuler, and as Karina said, I'm the Assistant Director of International Student Services here at what we call ISPO. So today we'll talk about your students' support system at ISPO and on campus. We will review your students' visa documents and discuss their F1 and J1 regulations. Also, we'll review resources for travel and what your students can do if they encounter any issues when entering the US. Your students should have already attended a Know the Rules orientation session with ISPO, and that session covered very similar information to this one. So although your student is responsible for their status, it's great that you as parents will also understand their visa documents. ISPO is here for your student. We know that this quarter will be unlike any other quarter at UCSD. And as your student prepares to start their program of study here, whether from abroad or physically here in La Jolla, please know that the International Students and Programs Office is here to help with any questions that they may have. We know that UC San Diego is a very large, decentralized campus, it can be confusing to know where they should go for help. And they can start right here with ISPO, and we will point them in the right direction. So your students' immigration documents are extremely important, as you know. They not only show that the student is in the US in a valid status, but they may also be used to open a bank account, apply for a driver's license, apply for work authorization, and other benefits. So let's take a look at some of these documents. So let's first take a look at your student's passport. The passport is issued, of course, by your student's country of citizenship. Your student should ensure that the biographical information is correct and accurate. They should also note the expiration date. The passport must be valid for at least 6 months into the future from the date of entry into the US. And the passport can be renewed inside or outside the US at your country's embassy or consulate. The next document is your student's US visa. And I understand that for a lot of you, a lot of your students, they may still be outside the US. They may not have received their F1 visa yet. And I understand that at this time, US embassies and consulates are kind of having a rollout of openings. So, you know, please continue to check the US consulate and embassy websites in your student's home country to see, you know, when you can schedule those appointments. Hopefully they will be able to renew their visa or apply for their visa in time for their entry into the US if they're planning to come for the winter term. So the visa. The visa page should be located inside of your student's passport once they receive it. The visa is like a key. Like a key, the student must have it to enter the US. But once they are inside the US, if the key or if the visa expires, that's okay. As long as the student is following the rules of their F1 or J1 status, they can remain in the US with an expired visa. If the visa expires while they are in the US, like I said, that's fine. It can only be renewed outside the US. So if the visa expires, the next time that your student travels outside, they will renew it at that point outside the US. Okay, next slide. Next one. Yes. So the next document that we'll talk about is the Form I-20, which is the certificate of eligibility used to apply for the F1 visa. And we'll also talk about the DS 2019 for those parents who might be parents of students wanting to enter the US in J1 status. And that document is called the DS 2019. So F1 and J1 students are also obligated to keep their Form I-20 or Form DS 2019 up to date. Students should submit any changes to this document within 10 days of any change. And this includes major updates. So if your student changes their major, they need to make sure to report that information to ISPO so we can update that on their Form I-20 or DS 2019. Next slide. Now we're gonna talk about what's called the Form I-94. And what's important to realize is if your students are outside the US, they will not have this form at this time. The Form I-94 can only be generated and printed out by your student once they have arrived in the US. This document is known as the Arrival Departure Record, and it can be printed out by visiting the US Customs and Border Protection website, which is listed here on this slide. The Form I-94 shows how the US Port of Entry admitted your student. So it will reflect the class of admission, which would be F1 or J1, and it will show how long they are admitted for, the admit until date. So for our F1 and J1 students, it should say admit until and then a D/S, which stands for duration of status. And this basically means that they can remain in the US for as long as they are still maintaining their student status. Next slide. In addition to your students' immigration documents, they will also need to report their most updated addresses to ISPO. And they can do this by updating their addresses through Triton Link. And there's a link here for Triton Link that they can access. This is also where your students will report their emergency contact information. And this is really important for all of our international students and our international families, that they have a current and updated emergency contact, so we know who to contact in case we need to, in the case of an emergency. This can be a family member or a friend that is either inside or outside the US. Your students' immigration documents, as I said, are extremely important. Oh, sorry, hold on one moment. Oh yes, so knowing the rules. So when your student is here in F1 or J1 status, it's important to understand, it's important for them to understand how to maintain their status. So once they've entered the US, all the way through the end of their academic program, once they are done with their academic program, they have to follow these rules and regulations of the F1 or J1 status. One important thing to note is that for a lot of our families whose students will not enter the US until winter 2021 or later, they are not yet in F1 or J1 status. You can only be in F1 or J1 status once you have first entered the US and activated that record. Next slide. So what does it mean to maintain good F1 or J1 status once they are here? So this means that your student follows the US federal regulations for their type of visa. For our students, they will need to follow these rules. They'll need to check that their visa documents are accurate upon every arrival to the US. They will need to enroll full-time each academic term. So that is every fall, winter, and spring term. They must be enrolled full-time. The summer term is considered a vacation term, so enrollment is not required. If your student needs to drop below 12 units for academic or medical reasons, they can speak with an ISPO advisor about the exceptions to the full-time enrollment requirement. As I mentioned before, your student will need to report any updates to their I-20 or DS 2019 document to ISPO. And they'll need to report address changes. So where they currently reside, where their permanent address is, within 10 business days through Triton Link. And finally, they can accept only authorized employment. Students are eligible to work on campus at UC San Diego, but they must request the proper work authorization in order to work off campus. They can find out more about employment authorization and eligibility through ISPO's website. And if you want to find out more about your students' employment eligibility and work authorization, there is another webinar later this week for our parents and families. And then finally, your student must maintain adequate health insurance while in the US. travel and emergency contacts. So as many of your students are preparing to travel or will travel eventually to enter the US, they can visit itravel.ucsd.edu to learn about what documents they will need when seeking entry or re-entry into the US. And prior to travel, it's important for your student to know how to contact ISPO if they encounter any issues at the US port of entry. I'm thinking that this would be pretty rare, but ISPO is available during and after business hours for emergency travel situations. Your student should take note of how to contact ISPO by visiting our icontact.ucsd.edu webpage. And from that page, they can download and save. There's an image here of our emergency contact card, which we always advise students print this out, keep it in their wallet. They can also print it out and keep it with their important immigration documents. So this is accessible to them when they need it. So finally, I hope that some of this information was beneficial to you. Before we move on to the Q&A portion of this webinar, here are some of the links to the many resources and information that we have on ISPO's website at istudents.ucsd.edu. We really look forward to welcoming your student to UC San Diego this fall term, whether it's virtually or here in person at UC San Diego. We're always available through Zoom advising, email. We've expanded our advising hours to accommodate students who are abroad as well.
Thanks, Trisha, for this great information. If I could ask Dan to slide back to the list of resources, I wanted to call everyone's attention. In addition to the emergency contact information that Trisha just mentioned, there's another form of emergency contact that we ask you to talk to your student about updating their information on Triton Link. And what they can do is visit students.ucsd.edu and look for the link where they can update their local address, their phone number, their email, but also the emergency contact. So I wanted to bring that piece of the PowerPoint slide to your attention. So I want to know, we have a good number of participants on the presentation. There's a feature down below. It's a raise hand feature. You can find that on your screen really quickly. I'm just gonna ask, just to get to know who's here. Raise your hand if your student is learning from home this fall quarter. Should be able to see that going. About 24, okay. Okay, I'm gonna ask you to lower your hand. Thank you. And now raise your hand if your student is learning from campus. They're currently on campus or making their way to campus. Okay, just a few. All right, go ahead and lower your hand. And then raise your hand if your student is studying on an F1 visa at UC San Diego. F1 visa. Okay. 14 out of 62. Okay, go ahead and, oh, we have more. Go ahead and lower your hand. That's okay, go ahead and lower your hand. And then raise your hand if your student is studying on a J1 visa. Okay, I think just one. All right, just wanted to get to know who was here with us. Okay, we have some questions in the Q&A, so we'll go ahead and move on to the question and answer portion of the PowerPoint. Trisha, I hope you're ready. We have some good ones for you. The first question is, how do I amend my I-20 if I need to change my program start date? What type of amendment is that?
Yes, that's a good question. So if you are the parent of a student or a student who will not be physically coming to campus in fall, you would need to request an amendment to your I-20 or DS 2019 document to change the program start date to a winter 2021 start date. To do that, you would log into the iPortal, iportal.ucsd.edu, and submit the new admit I-20 or DS 2019 amendment form. And when you go through that, it will ask you the right questions to amend your document.
Thank you. I want to make a quick announcement as well. If you speak Portuguese, if you speak Mandarin and you would like to pose your questions in Portuguese or Mandarin, in addition to Vietnamese, we have folks who are able to answer your questions in those three languages. So again, Vietnamese, Portuguese, and Mandarin, you may ask your questions in those languages. All right, Trisha, we have another one. Is a new I-94 generated each time the student re-enters the US?
Good question. So yes, the I-94, a new I-94 is generated each time a student re-enters. So a student will need to check their I-94 every single time they enter the US.
Okay, I think this next question is probably related. It's probably combined from the first and second question. If I arrive to the US with my F1 visa, but I am no longer staying for the fall quarter, do I still need to fill out the I-94 form of when I arrived and left the US?
So the I-94 it's not something that you fill out. It's something generated by the US government. So when you depart the US, you don't have to do anything with the I-94. But when you do, if you decide to depart the US after you've entered in the fall, visit itravel.ucsd.edu to make sure you understand what you would need for re-entry to the US.
There's a question that says, what happens if their visa gets rejected?
So if your visa is denied after a visa interview, you have to take a look at what the visa denial reason is. And if there is further evidence or something new that you can show, then you can apply for another visa interview. And hopefully with that new evidence or new circumstance, hopefully then the consulate would be able to issue that visa for you.
Okay, let's see here. When will I have to arrive to campus if I plan for winter 2021? If I plan to be on campus for winter 2021?
So if you have a winter 2021 I-20 or DS 2019, it should have a January 4th, 2021 program start date on it. With that start date, you are eligible to enter the US up to 30 days prior to that date. And we advise students to enter the US no later than 2 weeks into the quarter. So the Friday of week 2. So it gives you a little, a bit of a window in which you can arrive to the US. I know that right now a lot of planning needs to go into travel. So, take into account travel restrictions, potential quarantine, if those things are still in place at that time.
And we also want to let folks know that returntolearn.ucsd.edu is a good URL to bookmark for yourself. This is the place where campus-wide announcements are made related to academics, to housing, to facilities, just to the campus in general, that you can learn from. You can also sign up for Triton alerts on the same URL, returntolearn.ucst.edu, so that you can receive notifications when an announcement has been made. Trisha, here's another question for you. Is it possible to switch to F1 visa in the future from another type of visa? If so, would my student have to contact the department, and when should they do so?
So if the student is already here in the US in a different visa under a different visa status, they can apply for what's called a change of status. And they should come and talk with ISPO about that process. It can be complicated, so there are two different ways to apply for a change of status. They can remain in the US and apply for the F1 status through USCIS, through US Citizenship and Immigration Services, or they can plan to travel, depart the US, apply for the F1 visa at the US Embassy or Consulate, and then enter the US in that way in the F1 status. But refer them to ISPO, and we'll talk them through that process.
Mm-hmm. For US citizens staying currently abroad and planning to go to the US to study, do they need an F1 or J1 visa?
No, US citizens do not need a visa to enter the US or to study in the US.
Okay, there's a lot of questions here. The embassy has a new requirement. They are asking for a letter from the university stating that the winter program requires the student to be on campus. It's not really a question there, it's a statement, but wondering if that jogs any information for you, Trisha.
Yeah, we've been hearing about this. Not all embassies are requiring that. I think it's some specific embassies that are requesting this information. If your student is, or if that embassy or consulate is requesting that, please email inewstudent@ucsd.edu, and an advisor will respond with what we can do. Our winter 2021 plan is not yet set on campus, so.
My visa appointment is getting delayed due to COVID. What could be the impact for winter 2021?
So in order to enter the US in F1 or J1 status, the student must have a valid F1 or J1 visa. So potentially there may be a delay in entry to the US.
Can I have both B2 and F1 visa? If I travel to the US for tourism, which one should I use?
That's a great question. So it is possible to have two different visa stamps in your passport, right? You can have a tourist visa in your passport. You can also have an F1 student visa in your passport. What matters is what visa you present to the port of entry when you enter the US. If your primary purpose is to come in and be a student, show the F1 visa. We do not want our students coming into the US on a tourist status. They are not eligible to study on the tourist status. So it's very important to use the appropriate visa when entering the US.
Very good. My student is planning to land in US on the 20th of December this year for winter quarter 2021, which is starting on the 4th of January 2021. Is it okay for him to travel on that day?
I'm assuming the question is it okay for the student to travel on December 20th?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is within 30 days of January 4th.
I will also direct the parent who asked this question to watch the webinar that we hosted yesterday on transitioning your students to the community of UC San Diego. It was at 4 o'clock. It is available on YouTube. There, a representative from Housing, Dining, and Hospitality talks about the dates of when winter quarter is happening, when students are going home for the holidays, and housing services during that time. So I encourage you to watch the webinars that were posted and recorded yesterday. Okay, let's see here. Let's see, when you study abroad from home for fall quarter, do you need to renew the visa when you're going back to the US for winter quarter?
So as long as your visa is still valid, it's not expired, it should be eligible for use. So if you have a valid F1 visa and a valid I-20, you're a continuing student or a new student, you should be eligible to request entry into the US.
Do international students have to be in 14 days to quarantine in the US prior to the start of the winter quarter?
So international students that are coming from, I believe it's level 2 and level 3 countries are required to quarantine for 14 days if they're arriving on campus.
How do I report my address in US to the officer at the US border before knowing the status of my dorm location? Is a hotel name okay?
So I don't know if you need to report a specific address at the US port of entry when requesting entry to the US. The officer may ask where you plan to reside or what institution you may be attending. But you should, I mean, when you're entering the US, you should have a plan in place for where you're going to be staying. Even if it's temporary, you know, maybe if you're temporarily staying at a hotel, you could indicate that to the port of entry officer.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Let's see here. What other travel documents a US citizen staying abroad needs to travel to US for study?
So this webinar is specific for F1 and J1 students. So US citizens are not applicable as to what I reviewed here.
Maybe follow up later on if they have specific questions with ispo.ucsd.edu. So last question, the consulate requires a proof of in-person classes to issue a visa for the fall quarter. What can be submitted for this?
So that's a good question. So ISPO does have a support letter on, if you log into iportal.ucsd.edu, we have a general support letter that you can provide either at the US consulate as well as at the port of entry that outlines the institution's hybrid model of instruction. Another thing that students have also been advised to use to verify their enrollment is, you know, printing out their Triton Link enrollment schedule, which could show your coursework and whether that coursework is in person or remote or hybrid.
Here's one last question, a very basic question as the parent says, what is considered an international student? I'm not sure my son is.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So our office considers an international student really anybody who is not a US citizen or a permanent resident, or in some of the more immigrant categories like asylee, refugee, but really anybody who's here under a non-immigrant visa may be considered an international student.
So that's the time that we have for questions. Trisha, I want to thank you so much for taking these questions. Again, everyone, your questions can be answered by visiting ispo.ucsd.edu. Again, once the recording is uploaded, you'll be able to refer back to the slide on resources where you can also have your questions answered through the URLs. Our folks in the International Students and Programs Office are also available to talk with your student via Zoom meetings or emails. So that's another way to also have your questions answered. Let's move to the next slide. So I will conclude with just a few much more information. I mentioned earlier that once uploaded, you are able to listen to the webinar in your preferred language, indicated by the arrow here on the screen on YouTube. You will select this feature. It says settings, and all you have to do is follow the 4 steps that are listed below in order to select the language from which you want to listen to the webinar. So we wanted to provide that for you. Next slide. Again, this entire week, we have webinars happening for the International Parent and Family Orientation. We started yesterday, we have a couple today. We look forward to spending the week with you, so please make a note for the following webinars that are coming up the next few days. If you want to learn more about them, you can always visit us on the URL that's listed below and select International and Parent and Family Orientation to learn more about our webinars. Next slide. Homecoming at Home is it's a campus-wide event that that's happening during October 19th through the 25th. It's at home, it's virtual for obvious reasons, but we encourage you to register for that. We bring staff, faculty, students, parents, and families to celebrate the Triton spirit of UC San Diego. My office, the Office of Parent and Family Programs, are hosting specific webinar sessions for parents and families. It's just another opportunity to get to know UC San Diego, its resources, and at the end of it all, to be able to learn what those resources are in order to support your student, whether they're studying from home or studying from campus. We want to thank you for your time. This is what we have for you today, and we hope to see you in about 22 minutes for our next PowerPoint presentation and webinar presentation with a panel of faculty who will talk about teaching at UC San Diego, academic support for your student, and meeting their goals academically. Thank you so much for your time. We hope to see you very soon and definitely for the rest of the week.